If only it was Chadwick by Louis Buss. The scrutiny of the handwritten inscriptions found in a 1935 edition of the book Self-Realization, bought on eBay, takes the author on a journey of inspiration and expectation, continued from the January-February issue. Part 5. A faint flicker of hope. But although there was still a faint flicker of hope, it seemed to grow a little dimmer each time I exposed it to the light of reason. Then I emailed the photographs of the book to David Godman, hoping that such a great authority might be able to throw some more light on the mystery. I was not disappointed. He soon wrote back, pointing out something very obvious that the rest of us had missed, something that seemed to extinguish all hope of its being Chadwick once and for all. One of the illustrations in the book shows Seshadri Swami. Above his picture, the mystery devotee has written, "Another yogi, friend of the Maharishi, living in a cave on Mount Arunachala. I am going to meet him soon." I must admit that in my excitement at finding the book and reading the notes about Bhagavan, I hadn't paid much attention to this. If anything about it had struck me as odd, it was perhaps the idea of Seshadri living in a cave. I can't claim to know much about him, but had always imagined him living round the town. In any case, it turned out that this wasn't the really odd thing. The really odd thing, as David Godman now pointed out, was that Seshadri had died in 1929. So, he certainly wasn't living in a cave, or anywhere else for that matter, when the note was written. And our mystery devotee certainly wouldn't have been off to meet him soon. The inscription above that picture was, in short, a bit of a howler, and it wasn't one that David thought Chadwick could have made. He would have been living in the ashram for almost a year by then, after all, which would certainly have been long enough to get his facts straight about a well-known local figure like Seshadri Swami. David thought it more likely that our mystery devotee was a relative newcomer, someone who had recently fallen under Bhagavan's spell and hadn't yet properly learnt his way around. The howler was doubly inexcusable in that self-realization itself clearly gives the facts about Seshadri's death and even describes how Bhagavan attended his funeral. In other words, the mystery devotee, whoever he was, must have sent the book back to his parents without actually bothering to read it himself. This is understandable enough, perhaps, given that he had the real Bhagavan at hand, and thus might have felt little need to waste his time reading some dry old biography. Yet, in a Sadhu's reminiscences, Chadwick clearly says that self-realization was the second book Bhagavan instructed him to read. It was hard to imagine that a devotee like him would have ignored such a command from his guru or not have carried it out to the letter. So he must have read self-realization, which meant that he simply couldn't have been the one who made that howler about Seshadri Swami. Yet, despite that one howler, the mystery devotee was not completely ill-informed. About the picture of Ganapati Muni, he writes, a disciple who has just died, which was absolutely correct, and of B.V. Narasimha who had by then gone to Sai Baba. He knew enough to say, the author of the book, a former disciple of the Maharishi. Even in the case of Seshadri, setting aside for a moment the little matter of his death, he had redeemed himself to some extent by writing, a friend of the Maharishi. This seems to show some understanding of the unique relationship between Bhagavan and Seshadri, which makes it doubly perplexing that he would have thought Seshadri was still living in that cave. In any case, short of clutching at straws, I had to admit that David was right. It seemed extremely unlikely that Chadwick, after spending so many months in the ashram and being specifically instructed by Bhagavan to read self-realization, would not have known that Seshadri was dead. Taken in conjunction with the other evidence about his family from a sadhu's reminiscences, this now seemed to make the case against Chadwick pretty crushing. The time had come to bow to the inevitable and admit that good old Chadwick was out of the running. The search for the mystery devotee would have to continue elsewhere. The problem was that if Chadwick were no longer a contender, I had little appetite left for the search. If it wasn't Chadwick, finding out for certain that it had been someone else could only be a disappointment. As long as I didn't know who it was, I could go on pretending to myself that it might have always been he. But if we actually solved the mystery, even that last hope would be extinguished. All in all, I felt a strong inclination to call off the search and accept, with a slightly disingenuous shrug of the shoulders, that the riddle of the mystery devotee could never be solved. Of course, I knew this wouldn't do. These riddles tend to nag at you till you have done all you can to solve them, and in any case, I felt a certain sense of obligation to the book and its sender. Unfortunately, whilst helping to eliminate Chadwick, David Godman had no suggestions of his own, though he had thought it significant. Our man went to meditate at the shrine of Krishna, all of which left us back pretty much where we had started, sending emails back and forth between India, America, and England as we tried to work out who on earth it might have been, and the next name on everyone's lips was Brunton's. This felt like a bit of a come down. To discover that my book had been inscribed not by Chadwick but by Brunton would be like finding out that a mysterious bundle of old poems had been written not by Shelley or Keats but by Matthew Arnold. Perfectly interesting, of course, and still a find in itself, but with nothing like the same romance, excitement, or glamour. Before I go on, let me point out that I have nothing against Brunton and, on the contrary, feel much affection and admiration for him. It is a rare destiny to have discovered Ramana Maharshi by one's own efforts and then to be single-handedly responsible for bringing him to the notice of the West. If we didn't have Brunton, after all, we probably wouldn't have Chadwick himself. Not only that, but I have read some of Brunton's later writings in which He describes spiritual experiences which seem to me quite extraordinary, though I am not perhaps the best person to judge. But the great thing about Brunton, and surely the reason that Bhagavan drew him to Arunachala before anyone else, was that he could write. The man was a natural, and I have often wished that more of those who visited Bhagavan had had a fraction of his novelist talent for bringing people and places so vividly alive. If anyone really wants to know what it was like to venture into the interior in those early days and discover Ramana Maharshi in his jungle hermitage, they have only to read those marvelously evocative chapters from A Search in Secret India. Nobody else has ever written about Bhagavan quite like that, and it is hardly surprising that so many people were drawn to him by this account. In fact, reading that gorgeous description of Bhagavan and his surroundings, the only surprise is that so many managed to resist chucking up their jobs and jumping on the first boat to India. Yet, despite all this, there has always been something ever so slightly dubious to me about Paul Brunton. I can't quite put my finger on it, but just as it comes naturally to talk about good old Chadwick, I somehow find myself equally tempted to start talking about poor old Brunton. Perhaps this is because poor old Brunton seems to have rubbed so many people up the wrong way, including Chadwick himself, and most disastrously for him, the all-powerful Chinnaswamy. Poor old Brunton was blessed or cursed with a bit of literary talent, but nothing like what you would call real genius, and there can be few more miserable fates than to be half a writer. Bhagavan himself has been reported as saying that it would be easy for talented artists to reach the very highest spiritual level, but that they will be distracted by the pursuit of fame. This certainly seems to have been the case with Brunton, who, after his success with A Search in Secret India, was compelled to write book after book, while good old Chadwick settled at Bhagavan's feet and never felt the slightest urge to leave. Poor old Brunton was driven by some inner demon to go gallivanting around the world, like the proprietor of a Victorian circus in search of fresh curiosities and freaks. Continued in the next issue.